for several weeks in regards to the topics of our Whole and Positive Power of Holiness Bible study here. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about not veiling the glory. And so we were cognizant of not doing things that would distract or cover the glory of God from being reflected in our lives, right?
Amen.
Because remember, that's the process, that when people see Jesus in us, it's because we are a reflection of Him, right? Amen. The glory is allowed to be reflected in our lives. Last week, we touched on the subject of all that glitters is not good. Okay, and so we talked specifically more about the jewelry aspect of all the glitters and baubles things. But we also kind of expounded on the realm of that and expanded it to cover, such things that might infiltrate our minds and allow us to be sucked into something else. Because remember, there's always going to be something, regardless of who we are, there's going to be something that tries to attract us, something that tries to draw us in. And from the perspective of the lesson that we were talking about, jewelry is that glimmery, shining thing that glitters in the sunlight or glitters in the darkness of the night when a light crosses its pathway. And maybe it doesn't have much effect on guys, but certainly for a lot of ladies, jewelry certainly does have an effect. But there are a lot of things that attract guys in that same perspective, that out of the corner of your eye or something that draws you in and has that same effect of making us try to find legal loopholes around the things of God. And anytime we're trying to find a way that this is right or to excuse why it's not wrong, then we already know in our heart that it was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay? And so that's what we were talking about, the subject matter of what we were looking at. Just don't focus on he's against jewelry. All right? Focus on this aspect that, remember, all that glitters is not good. There are things that will suck us and draw us in that are not beneficial for our walk with God. All right? And we may make excuses to make ourselves feel better, but remember, it's not productive in our walk with God. And that's what we're concerned about. All right, so as we enter today's lesson, and likely next week's lesson, we'll finish this up, we're talking on the subject matter of temples of glory. Temples of glory. And obviously, we get this from the perspective of whose temple are you? Well, the Bible says that we are a temple of God. Right?
Amen.
We were bought by a price. We are not our own. Correct?
Amen.
And so when we start looking at the subject matter of what we're talking about today in the temples of glory, we need to understand really what we're discussing today is going to be a perspective, maybe like a generational timeline, if you will, of where we have come and how did we get to where we are today. Okay? Because I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that moral decay is rampant and a spirit of sensuality holds us at bay in the world that we live in. Okay? I mean, you don't have to be convinced that sex is what sells in our society today, correct?
Right.
In fact, somebody came to me, and it was somebody that was supposedly in church, and they told me for my business I should get a commercial and I should have ladies in my commercial to sell computers. And I said, well, no, we don't need to go that route. And that was supposedly somebody in church. The understanding that we need to have is we understand there's a moral decay that's running rampant in our society, and we have seen it grow through the years. I mean, several of you may not be able to go back too many decades, but certainly you can remember what it was like when you were a child, when you were a teenager, maybe when you were in your 20s. If you're blessed enough to have passed the 20s, then maybe you remember what it's like when you hit 30. And you can see the decay as it traverses through that line. Now, for those of you who are even older than that, maybe 70s and 80s, you can remember way back to when some of these things that hit our timeline first came out.
Right.
You're going to be able to look back into your memory at the emergence of some of the changes, some of the phenomenon that changed our society from what it was intended to be by God to what it is today. And so, as we look at temples of glory, we're looking at it from this aspect, okay? Nudity has become commonplace, and I made mention of this at my dinner table the other night, and I'll just make mention of it here. I had heard a song on the radio, and so I typed in the lyrics that I was confused about in Google. I'm sure everybody Googles, it's the new dictionary. Yeah. And so I had typed in the words hit like a rainbow, I think was what it was. And I was trying to figure out what was the intended purpose. Are those really the lyrics? Who sings this song? What does that mean, hit like a rainbow? I mean, I've walked through, I can't tell you how many places thinking of hit like a rainbow. What does that really mean? Because I've never seen a rainbow hit anything. And so here I just YouTube pulls up and I click on play, and it's a Miley Cyrus thing. And all of a sudden, it's not really hit like a rainbow. It's something about wrecking ball. Sounds like rainbow, at least to me and several other people. And unfortunately for me, she sings that song unclothed. And so nudity is prevailing everywhere. Let's just let it be said. All right? Now I know where the rainbow came in. All right. So you can see that is not just the extreme. When I was growing up, things like that would have been extreme, and they would have tried to cover certain areas of a person's anatomy in some way to give the appearance of nudity without showing you nudity. Nowadays, it doesn't matter. We're just going to throw it out there, and you can deal with it. If you don't like it, you don't have to look at it. It's kind of the thought process that comes in the world today. And so we see that, what was deemed as scandalous attire years ago is now the norm today. Yeah. What was deemed as immoral actions in years gone by is now the norm today. Right. And so what we really need to do is find out, how did we get to where we are today? If we understand the process that took place, then maybe as church-going individuals who love God, maybe we can put the brakes on and we can reverse the process, at least in our lives. And if we understand where God was coming from when God said, this is the way it should be, maybe we won't try to push the envelope and try to push us into some of the immoral areas of where sensuality is the main concept and where immorality is a real problem. All right? All right, so let's get into this, because you don't become desensitized to these things overnight. I have preached on tolerance a ton of times, and desensitization does not happen overnight. It's a process. Okay? You become exposed to something, and maybe, yes, you reject it, but you've been exposed. And as you've been exposed to it a second time or a third time, you become desensitized to its effect. It doesn't engender the same feeling within you the second and third time. Lord have mercy on her. She wants to preach.
Praise the Lord.
We're going to have to work on that. Hallelujah. And so you don't become desensitized overnight. And so let's look at where this desensitization has become. Where did it come from? Where did we start? Because we all know that this goes back to the Garden of Eden. We all know that this goes back to Adam and Eve. Okay? And it'll come out in our lesson that they were created in what?
Nakedness.
Innocence is the word I was looking for. We've already discussed some bit of nakedness, and so I was hoping we wouldn't go there. But yes, they were naked, but they didn't realize they were naked because God had created them in innocence. They had no realization of what nakedness was. There was no guilt. There was no shame. And it's like an infant that's born today. That infant comes out and it's just laying there and waving its arms and its legs, and it doesn't think a thing about it. Why? Because it's innocent. Right? Okay? But you get a little bit older and all of a sudden conscience begins to set in. And when Adam and Eve sinned, we entered into a time of conscience. When we entered into a time of conscience, what does the Bible say? Immediately, they knew they were naked, and they tried to cover themselves. Okay? So let's see how this has entered into the time frame where we have gone from wearing long sleeves to short sleeves to no shirts. Where we've gone from wearing holy apparel to moderately holy apparel to no apparel, as we've just laid out and discussed. All right. So, men and women's clothing through the 18th and 19th centuries remained fairly modest. Okay, I'm not going to say it was the picture of perfection in God's eyes, but for the most part, across the board, I'm not just talking church people, I'm talking across the board, it was fairly modest. Styles change from time to time. Obviously, styles change from year to year, decade to decade. Fads and fashions come and go. Skirts stayed ankle length or floor length for women because it was thought that a woman that showed her ankles to public was a loose woman. Okay? We don't think that same way today, do we? No. Now, the women that show their toes through their shoes, now we got to second thought about that. All right, I'm just teasing. All right. So, during this time, men's and women's clothing continued to show a great amount of distinction between the sexes. Their characteristics were different. Women wore dresses while men wore trousers. And at this particular point in time, it was unconceivable that a woman would wear men's apparel. Okay? It was a foregone conclusion. Nobody even dreamt, hey, I wonder what it would be like if I wore my husband's pants. Okay? Nobody even thought about it. All right? And neither did men wear women's apparel. It's sad that I would have to add that perspective into this, but at this particular time, it was never even thought of that men or women would wear the others. In 1850, okay, the end of the century there, the first assault was made on this conventional dress code. Okay? Now, I'm going to throw this out there and I'm going to say it, and you're going to look at me and go, what's wrong with that? Okay? But it goes to show you where we have come from to where we are today. The great assault in 1850 that was done on this conventional dress code was the introduction of trousers under short dresses. Do we know what those were called?
Were they called bloomers?
They were called bloomers after the feminist editor Amelia Bloomer. Okay? In 1850, the introduction, it was just the first presentation of bloomers was made. The outcry was great. Everybody screamed, how could you wear pants? Why would you ever put pants on a young lady? Why would you wear pants under your dress? That is an abomination. People were screaming from the rooftops. And I'm not just talking church people. I'm talking society in general. Now you might think, I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay? I'm just trying to let you know. We have become desensitized from where we were. All right? Now, because the public outcry was great, they went away. But just like I had mentioned before, desensitization starts showing it to you once. Okay, I'm going to pull it back. It's going to come back again. And it's not going to be as rigidly objected to as it was the first time. And maybe we pull it back the second time. And guess what? It's going to come back again. And with every successive time that it comes back, it's more widely accepted. All right? And so let's progress down this pathway, if you will, and see where we go. In 1890, a cartoonist created the likeness of a beautiful woman, epitomizing the Victorian feminine ideal. The artist's name, or the cartoonist's name, is Charles Dana Gibson. And of course, the all-American icon that was created was called the Gibson Girl. Now, some of you may have looked up the Gibson Girl because certainly you're not old enough to really remember that icon. Maybe you've seen some antique items that marked the Gibson Girl. she would retain an extreme level of popularity for many, many years, several decades down the line. During this same decade, there was another attempt to introduce masculine clothing for women. This new fashion was specifically designed for those ladies who rode bicycles. Now, can you imagine what that would be? Not leggings, no. Has anybody heard of the skirt?
Yes.
Okay, what is a skirt?
It's
It's a skirt, sort of.
with shorts.
When you're standing together with your legs together, it all looks flowy like it's one skirt.
Oh,
But if
gotcha.
you spread your legs apart, it's actually two separate, it's almost like pants, correct? Because it goes down like pants. It just has the illusion of a skirt when your legs are together. It was designed for bike riders. They called it the divided skirt back in that day and era. Now, public outrage was not so great. And the reason was because it had the illusion of a skirt, but it had a functionality that was unique to those who wanted to ride bikes. So it wouldn't be accepted by everybody, but if you're an avid bike riding lady, then maybe you needed to wear it and wear it only for this occasion. Okay? Now you see, the desensitization had started. Now there's something functional that we're wearing for a specific purpose. You see how we start to drift and things begin to come in through the door? This style was generally accepted. Again, it filled a specific purpose in somebody's life, and it was only accepted. It's not like ladies went around just wearing skirts all day, or gauchos, or whatever they're called today. Okay? They wore them for bike riding, probably horseback riding. You understand the concept. But as with anything, what starts off being used for a purpose becomes expanded. And so we'll look at that. During this time, skirts remained long, and also hats loomed large. It was the type of era where hats were worn frequently. Makeup was still not something that we saw a lot of. Excuse me. The 20th century saw fashion, at the beginning of the 20th century saw a pretty good modest apparel, but it really began to launch the onset of the degradation or the moral decay of what we consider to be clothing. And so as we enter into this time frame, we're going to start talking about some eras of time, and you're going to recognize them from some history lessons that maybe you've learned, or maybe you had grandparents that set you on their knee and told you all about the good times, okay? And so you can think back to them from that sort. The first of these in the 20th century is going to be called the Roaring Twenties. Has anybody ever heard of the Roaring Twenties? 4 people. And Darren's one of them. Somehow that makes me nervous. All right. The Roaring Twenties. Several factors contributed to this deviation from behavior and the nature of apparel in the Roaring Twenties. And we're going to talk about, I think, 4 of them fairly quickly as we go through this portion. Because I want you to see, as the interjection of something came, it's acceptance. And maybe you, as you listen to this, maybe you're thinking, I don't see what's wrong with that, or I don't think that's so bad, or things like that. But it just was another knock into the wall, another notch that knocked down something that was previously held, and it allowed for a general desensitization of the bigger scope of things, okay? And so the first of these was actresses and professional models. Before this time, actresses and professional models really, A, they didn't exist in any kind of natural capacity, and B, that they were mostly theater people, and because the theater people, they were different. And so people didn't idolize them. But now you had actresses, we had movies, we had a genre that was being introduced to the public, and these actresses and professional models now were being looked at as idols. Okay? And we're going to look at a couple of those idols in particular. Rather than being seen as women of questionable character and morality, they were seen as celebrities. And of course, we all are very familiar with the term celebrity in our society today. Women begin to emulate them in their makeup, their hairstyles, and the fashions of clothing they wore. Okay. Is this time for me to pause? Okay. All right. And so women begin to emulate their makeup, their hairstyles, their fashion. They wanted to begin to be that idol. Okay? Because these actresses, these celebrities, these models were becoming idolized, they wanted to be that idol. And so they thought if they could emulate the styles that they wore, the styles of fashion that they exhibited, that maybe they would be idolized the same as the celebrity. And so one of those celebrities was a woman by the name of Theda Bara. She was called the vampire. I'm sure that most of you, unless you've had some kind of movie history appreciation type class, have no clue who she was. But she was the original sex goddess. Literally every movie that she starred in, she would seduce and ruin men. That was her position in life, was that type of a role. She was famous for very seductive clothing in that day. You would probably look at it in today's world and not even think it seductive, for one, and you wouldn't even think it risque, to be honest with you. But that was for that day and era. It was extremely seductive, and she wore what were considered to be hypnotic, kohl-rimmed eyes, heavy barbaric-looking jewelry. She was the vampire. Actors and actresses continued to heavily influence the behavior and fashions through this Hollywood onset. Okay, this was the bridging of Hollywood into our world, okay? So that was the first reason. Now, the second is this. There was this big movement in our government at this particular time, and we introduced one brand new thing. Does anybody have an idea what that brand new thing was?
President?
No, it wasn't a president.
That's a new thing. A new.
1920s, we voted on something, and an amendment was made.
Women's suffrage.
So women can
Women's
vote?
suffrage. Women got the right to vote. Okay? And with the right to vote, they left a lot of the same morals. That's close to president. We'll give Kaylee partial credit, okay? When they got the right to vote, they also took that right to vote and they began to discard some of the ways that they felt about things in the past. And they said, because I can be like a man at the voting block, let me be like a man in more ways. And so some of the traditional things they cast aside, morals, virtues, and things like that. The women of this particular time frame became known as the flappers.
Yeah.
Maybe a term you've heard before. The flappers were known, not every single person obviously during this time, but this was kind of the generic concept of a flapper. They openly necked in parked cars, they smoked cigarettes, and they danced the night away in roadhouses. Now, this was definitely not the norm of that day. This was a very drastic deviation from the norm. These were the women of that day, the flappers. Now, a third marker in this time frame that was an agent of change was the unveiling of King Tut's tomb. Everybody remember King Tut?
Mm-hmm.
What country did he come from?
Egypt.
Egypt. What was Egypt known for?
Sin.
Well, slavery and bondage was a pretty big thing of Egypt. There was the ruling class, and then there was the slave class. And we see that in biblical times where the children of Israel were made to be slaves, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and the same concept goes. And so when the discovery of King Tut's tomb came, women began to emulate the things that were discovered in the tomb. So there were painted faces, there were serpentine necklaces and bracelets, there was Egyptian-style tunics. All of a sudden that fashion came into our dress culture. And so these things became something that women sought for. Okay, unbeknownst to them, they were leaving the bondage of not being able to vote and picking up bondage in another fashion because they were wearing and emulating themselves after slaves of the Egyptian era gone by. And so that was the third agent. Finally, the fourth agent, or the fourth major factor contributing to this decline in the Roaring Twenties, was the moral demise that happened during the First World War. During the war years, fashions remained conservative. The only change was that skirts rose slightly from the floor. Remember, because they didn't show their ankles. Everybody remember that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now the skirts rose slightly from the floor because women had to be more productive in society. They had to move around a lot. They were doing some of work outside homes, serving as nurses and different things like that. And so for the sake of being able to perform those duties in a more efficient manner, the skirts raised to some point. Now, when I say raised slightly from the floor, don't want some of you to think that they became mini skirts. Okay, that's not a slightly raise. But when I say they rose from the floor, they went from here to like here. Okay, is everybody understanding what I'm talking about? When you go 3 inches up, that's slightly. Okay, everybody understanding what I'm talking about? We're not even talking about to the knees and things like they didn't show their calves. Literally, they moved it from below the ankle to above the ankle. All right? And so this was the other. After peace broke out, however, after the war, we saw this slight deviation. Okay? What happened was, as men were coming back from the war, instead of hems of these skirts going back down, unfortunately, the hems of the skirts continued to rise. Okay? Now, I'm going to try to do this as politically correct as possible and as nice a manner as I can. But to be honest with you, there's less men than women. There's more competition for the men that are there. So what do? Everybody's in church like,
attention.
I don't know what I would do. But you know exactly what you'd do. You'd fight with other women to get the man that you wanted, right? And one of the things that they did to do that was, from the sensuality perspective, the hems of their skirts went up even further. So now instead of just above the ankle, they rose to show a little bit of calf.
Oh my goodness.
I'm glad the public outcry in the church is drastic tonight. Everybody's looking down at their skirts, pulling tonight. I don't know what the deal is. All right. So they also took on some other traditions or some other things that were deviations from former traditions. They cut their hair into more of a man-like, they bobbed their hair, all right? They cut it into more what we consider more of a man-like face type pose. They wore short dresses. They began to more openly, again, to try to attract men. They openly painted their faces, went around in public. And we talked about flappers and the Roaring Twenties and things like that in previous lessons as well. So now all of this is brand new. But these are the four things, the four major factors that marked one of the first great deviations from societal understanding of what apparel should be. Okay, we still have distinction between the sexes at this point. We've not broken that barrier yet, except for the women who wore gaucho-type divided skirts for bicycle riding and horseback riding, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, but we have, from a moral perspective, begun to desensitize society as to what is okay within the perspective of women's clothing and men's clothing. Okay, so the seeds that were sown years ago from Amelia Bloomer and those after that are now becoming more prevalent, and you see it coming back again. And the desensitization is progressing rapidly. Okay, that was the Roaring Twenties. We enter into a new era. Okay, it is the 1930s. Okay, the 1930s brought us a breath of fresh air. In the 1930s, we saw the introduction of longer skirts again. So we saw sort of a pulling back to a previous gone era. But unfortunately, at this time, they found that we could wear longer skirts and still be seductive. Anybody got an idea?
Lower the neckline?
Add a slit.
No, we're going to add a slit. They call them cut-up skirts. Okay, cut-up skirts. And this, again, it was introduced by an actress. She was a famous sex symbol of the 30s. Her name was Jean Harlow. Again, remember, okay, if anybody even wants to tell me that celebrities do not affect,
Right.
our society and the moral decay, then I can give you a history lesson from the gates of hell that shows that celebrities were put on this earth to morally desensitize our society and bridge the decay that is needed for Satan to have rule, okay? I know that sounds religious in nature, okay? But I want you to understand that this moral decay is something, and here we go, we're going to throw another celebrity, another idol out there for us. Her name was Jean Harlow. Okay, and Jean Harlow was a seductress. She was a woman. She was called the blonde bombshell. So if there's any of you that like blondes, she was the blonde bombshell. And she was famous for her seductiveness, not because her not because her skirts were short. See, I got it out that time. But because she found another way. And see, if you've got nice long legs, and you walk seductively, then you can put out there where it splits and you catch a glimpse of it, and then it's gone. And you catch a glimpse of it, and it's gone. And you catch a glimpse. And see, that plays more upon the mind of those that are looking than almost seeing it all the time. And that, my friends, was introduced to us in the 1930s. These slits underscored her sex appeal. From this time forward, clothing never returned to the formal levels of modesty that we had seen prior to this. All right? So, the 40s and 50s followed the fashion trends that were started in the 20s with short skirts, heavy makeup, and cut hair. What else happened in the 40s, 50s?
40s, 50s?
Anybody?
World War II.
World War II happened during that time frame. I knew somebody would eventually get it. World War II. I know none of you are from back in that. Not even I'm from back in that time frame, and I'm like old as dirt. I know. And so the 40s and 50s introduced something else into our world, and that was another world war. Remember, World War I, we saw the introduction of some things. Skirt lines began to come up, right?
Yeah.
When the World War ended, we also saw the bobbed hair. We saw the makeup. We saw the skirt lines come up even more as people were doing what people do, okay? World War II began to introduce something totally different. In the introduction of World War II, trousers became formally and totally accepted as feminine attire. Okay? It wasn't the first emergence of women wearing trousers, because remember we had the divided skirt. But remember, it had a purpose. It had a function. It was only worn for that function. Now, as everyday attire for women, trousers or pants, as we would call them today, are now formally and totally accepted among the women. And this progressed further in their quest for liberation and equality, not inequality, but equality with men. The fashions of the 20s came full circle when we started looking at the 60s. Now, what is the one thing, if anything, anybody knows about the 60s?
Love and peace.
Okay, love and peace. Drugs. Okay, these are the things that marked the era. They were similar in fashion to the 20s. Just a slight variation on it, okay? And so we know the sit-ins, the love-ins, we know the nudist colonies with freedom. That was kind of the terminology. They had free love and free drugs, and everything was freedom. It was liberty from the oppression of religion. It was freedom from the oppression of government. It was freedom from the oppression of war. And that was the mark that they had in the 60s. It was freedom. And you've heard of Woodstock, right? Mm-hmm. And that was a concert to mark freedom, right? And some of you may have parents and grandparents that were a part of Woodstock. And some of you should ask them, and so that you can become fully embarrassed that they were there. And if they are honest with you and tell you some of the things they did while they were there, you could probably be even more fully embarrassed.
Woodstock, you don't remember it.
True, if you were really at Woodstock, you probably don't remember it. That's probably true. All right, the 20s flapper had her mannish figure with her bobbed hair, her kohl-rimmed eyes, and she wore knee-grazing dresses, okay? So they just basically barely came to the knee. Now, the 60s was marked and embodied really in, there was a person, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of her. Her name was Twiggy.
Yeah.
Okay, just one person has heard of Twiggy. And Twiggy had boyish looks. She was stick thin in her figure. She also had bobbed hair, and she had the kohl-rimmed eyes. However, she took the clothing capacity to a brand new level of immodesty. Okay? She brought along the introduction and the inception of the miniskirt. Okay?
Yep.
Remember, the flappers brought it up a level, and they had the knee-grazing dresses. Well, Twiggy and those that idolized Twiggy in the 60s, they took it to a whole new level, and that was the miniskirt. Now, it may not be a miniskirt in the capacity that you see in our world today. Okay?
All right.
The true mini skirts that we have in our world today are so short that you can see a woman's butt cheek when she's walking down the street, much less she can't sit on her skirt. Okay? Mm-hmm. The mini skirts of this day were just a tad longer than that. They could actually still sit on the skirt, but not much longer. And you can still understand the great drastic level of immodesty it was brought, because now not only would you see the calves and the ankles and, oh my God, their knees, but then we now introduced a new level of nakedness, and that was the thigh. All right? And you see where we're coming from in all these things, okay? All right. So again, in comparison, while the flappers, openly necked in parked cars and smoked cigarettes and danced the night away in roadhouses, the people of the children of the 60s and 70s became involved in psychedelic drugs, marijuana, love-ins, nudist colonies, and the sexual revolution that had begun 40 years earlier bore bitter fruit, resulting in the complete destruction of moral values. And you can look at the 60s and 70s in comparison to where we are today, and that still looks more modest and more moral than where we stand today. But it was part of the desensitization that brought us to the point and the place where we are today. All right?
Yeah.
Okay. Fashion designers such as Rudy Gunright, it's a quote, he continued to design articles of clothing intended to chisel away at the national prudery. Okay? They set out with goals of making clothes that pushed the bounds. Okay? Has anybody seen these see-through dresses?
Yes.
Okay? Mm-hmm. If you'd introduced them years and years and years ago, they would have never made it. Okay? But designers, fads and fashions are born out of designers. Designers are always pushing the envelope of what's acceptable. Okay? And all it takes, I want you to understand, designers cater their clothing to celebrities. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give them to celebrities. And if I get a celebrity, a Lady Gaga, who wears it to the Oscars, which I think just happened last weekend or something like that. Or if I get, an actress that's going to be reading or performing or something at something that's seen worldwide.
Right.
Okay? Then all of a sudden, I can promote that article of clothing because so-and-so. It's a Michelle Obama original. You know, because now it has a tag on it. You understand what I'm saying? And the designers are always pushing the envelope of what's acceptable and pushing us into new bounds. And as they push the envelope, if we're not careful, we just follow like lemmings right behind all of it. And we're looking and chasing after fads and fashions. And we forget the concepts of what God has instituted in our lives of what is moral and modest. He didn't tell us in the Word of God, thou shalt not wear skirts above thine ankles. Did he? He didn't tell us, thou shalt not wear, and you can fill in the blank. What he did tell us was that our clothes had got to be modest. Throughout the Old and the New Testaments, he's pushing us in the direction of modesty. Because he knew that the fight would not be about where's the measurement. It's about what is modest. All right? And so, in the 1960s, Rudy Gernreich introduced such styles as topless bathing suits, see-through blouses, mini dresses inset with clear vinyl strips, the cut-up skirt. We know it as a skirt with slits. Is that right?
Yep.
Slits. Would resurface as skin revealing was prevalent. Popular new fashions such as bikinis, hot pants, and halter tops swept through the marketplace. It's hard to believe, isn't it? I mean, most of you in this place tonight are young in comparison to what we're talking about. And so when you were growing up, a lot of these things were already the norm. Right?
Yep.
And so this may not be a, oh my goodness, is that where it came from kind of thing to you, because it was already the norm when you were growing up. But if you could see and look back to the years gone by, and we don't have to take it all the way back to the days that Jesus walked on the face of this earth to find modesty.
Right.
Okay? And that's what I'm trying to illustrate for you today, because I want you to understand that your body is the temple of the living God. And it is intended to be a temple of glory unto God. And what we put on this temple matters. Okay? It matters. We need these things to be modest, holy, and acceptable unto God. I'll wrap it up fairly quickly here, and we'll break this lesson between this week and next week. We'll finish it up. But as inhibitions were consistently lowered, people grew more accustomed to exposing their flesh. Okay? The moral destruction of a nation was revealed in the clothing that is worn by its citizens. Okay? A celebrity may be the 1%ers of society. Now think about this. Okay? Celebrities may be just 1% of all society in our nation. But if all of our nation is chasing those celebrities,
Right.
then the destruction of our nation is being revealed by what celebrities do. Now think about that. As James Laver has remarked, modes are but a reflection of the manners of the time. Clothing is inevitable. And let me explain what that means. The moral condition of the church will be manifested by the styles that are adopted and embraced by its constituents. Clothing is merely an outward expression of an inward condition, an inward attitude. We've talked about holiness being both an outward expression of an inward attitude, correct? Clothing is that same way. If you're feeling down, then the outfit you wear shows the expression of, it's the outward expression of how you're feeling, correct? If your morality is declining, your clothing becomes an outward expression of that. Clothing is inevitable. They're nothing less than, and this is a quote, they're nothing less than the furniture of the mind being made visible. All right?
Yeah.
Because in general, a lot of the clothing that we buy and a lot of the clothing that we wear, we don't give it a lot of thought. It's not something that we sit here and we dwell on and say, is this something I should get or is this not? Is this something I should wear or is it not? Because what happens is we start feeling a certain way and we start falling into society in a certain way, and so has it, so I want it. She wears it, so I want to wear it. He's talking about it, so I want to talk about it. And so it becomes a reflection of what's going on the inside. Let me stop here. It's a good stopping place and allows us to pick up kind of with an introspective look. We've kind of walked through several decades of time through the 20th century, talking in particular about some of the things that brought this desensitization and this moral decay when it comes to modesty and holiness in our world. Now, again, I'm not just talking about the church. And I want that to ring reticent in your mind. Okay? This is not the church that I'm talking about. This is the world. At least from one perspective, the culture of the United States of America. All right? And so I want you to say, well, the church used to be so holy, but the world certainly wasn't like that. No, I want you to understand, these were the accepted ways of dressing and thinking about dress in the entire culture of the United States. Okay? And so this desensitization has happened across our entire culture. The bad part about that is as people become desensitized to the culture in our world, they bring that desensitization into the church. And they find it hard to follow the guidelines and patterns of holiness that God has called us to. Modesty becomes a foreign concept in our younger generation because they're chasing after idols and celebrities. You see the concepts that we're fighting against here? Mm-hmm. And so we'll develop that a little bit more, and we'll go back to the perspective that I started with when we talked about Adam and Eve in the garden, and that's where we'll start from next time when we finish up on the temples of glory. All right, let's stand all around the